Park sits at the edge of North Salt Lake, Utah. It is a small green rectangle of grass and playground equipment, bordered by quiet residential streets. During the day, mothers push strollers through its paths, and children chase each other across the open field. At night, it is empty. The parking lot goes dark. The playground equipment stands motionless. The only sound is the occasional hum of a car passing on the road beyond the trees. At 2:59 in the morning, on June 17th, 2019, a grey Lyft sedan pulled into that parking lot. A young woman stepped out of the back seat. She was 23 years old. She had blonde hair. She was carrying a backpack and pulling a small rolling suitcase. She had landed at Salt Lake City International Airport less than an hour earlier, stepping off a connecting flight from Los Angeles. She had not gone home. She had not called a friend. She had told the Lyft driver to bring her here, to this park, in the middle of the night. The driver later told investigators that another car was already waiting in the lot when they arrived, a dark-colored vehicle. The young woman walked toward it. She did not hesitate. She did not look around nervously. She appeared to recognize the car or the person inside it. She climbed in. The Lyft driver pulled away. That was the last time anyone outside of the man in that car saw Mackenzie Lueck alive. At 2:58 a.m., 1 minute before she stepped out of the Lyft, Mackenzie had sent her last text message. It was to the person she was about to meet. The message confirmed she had arrived. After that, her phone went dark. Not off, not on airplane mode, dark. The signal dropped completely. It never came back on. Not that night, not the next morning, not ever. A 23-year-old woman's entire digital existence, every app, every message thread, every social media account, every contact in her phone, went permanently silent at 2:59 a.m. in a parking lot in North Salt Lake. And for the next 12 days, no one outside of one man knew why. This is the story of Mackenzie Lueck, but it is also the story of two versions of Mackenzie Lueck. Two tracks running side by side, one visible, one hidden. Not because there was anything wrong with the hidden one, not because the hidden one explains what happened to her, but because the distance between those two tracks is where the danger lived. The danger was not the dating app. The danger was not the late-night meeting. The danger was the man she was meeting, a man who had his own two tracks, his own surface, and his own underneath. And his underneath was far darker than anything Mackenzie could have imagined when she opened that car door. The surface of Mackenzie Lueck's life looked like exactly what it was, a young woman building something. She had grown up in El Segundo, California, a small coastal city pressed against the western edge of Los Angeles International Airport. Her parents, Greg and Diana Lueck, raised her in a comfortable home. She was their only child. She was bright, she was social, she was athletic. In high school, she joined the swim team. She competed, she trained. She built the kind of discipline that carries a person forward through the tedium of early morning practices and the sting of chlorine and the monotony of laps counted in the hundreds. After high school, she enrolled at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. It was a deliberate choice. She wanted distance from home, but not so much distance that she could not fly back for a weekend. Salt Lake City gave her that. The mountains, the campus, a new life with a return ticket, always available. She declared a major in kinesiology. She wanted to understand the human body, how it moves, how it heals, how it breaks. Her longer-term ambition was nursing school. She saw kinesiology as a foundation, a way to understand anatomy and movement and physiology before stepping into a clinical setting where she would apply that knowledge to patients. She rushed and pledged Alpha Chi Omega. Sorority life at the University of Utah was not the cartoonish spectacle sometimes depicted in films. It was a social structure, a network, a way to build friendships in a city where she knew almost no one. Mackenzie thrived in it. She attended chapter meetings. She participated in philanthropy events. She posed for group photos in matching outfits and posted them on Instagram with the expected enthusiasm. Her sorority sisters described her as bubbly, outgoing, always smiling. She was the girl who showed up early and stayed late, the one who texted to check in when someone missed an event. Her Instagram feed was curated the way most 23-year-olds curate their feeds: travel photos, beach photos, group shots with friends, a trip to Europe, a visit home to California, the occasional selfie with a filter that smoothed everything into a pleasant, sun-drenched haze. Looking at her profile, you would see exactly what she wanted you to see: a young woman enjoying college, building a life, planning a future. That was track A. That was the Mackenzie Lueck that her parents knew. that her sorority sisters knew, that her professors and classmates and friends from high school knew. Track B existed simultaneously. It did not contradict Track A. It ran alongside it. Mackenzie had a profile on Seeking Arrangement, a website that connects young women, often called sugar babies, with older or wealthier men, often called sugar daddies, for relationships that typically involve financial support in exchange for companionship and often intimacy. Mackenzie's profile was not a secret in the way that a criminal record is a secret. It was private. It was compartmentalized. She kept it separate from her sorority life, from her family, from her Instagram presence. But it was not hidden out of shame. It was hidden the way most people hide the parts of their lives that do not fit neatly into the version they present to the world. This distinction matters. It matters enormously. Because what happened to Mackenzie Lueck was not caused by her profile on Seeking Arrangement. What happened to her was caused by a specific man she met through that platform. A man who, by the time Mackenzie climbed into his car at 3 a.m., had already decided what he was going to do to her. The dating profile did not create the danger. The man created the danger, and he would have been dangerous on any platform, on any app, in any context where he had access to a woman who trusted him enough to get into his car. Mackenzie had been active on Seeking Arrangement since at least 2018. She also used Tinder and other dating apps. The exchanges were what you would expect. Conversations, flirtation, arrangements made and sometimes kept, and sometimes not. She met men. She communicated with men. She navigated the transactional ambiguity of a platform designed to blur the line between dating and financial arrangement. None of this was illegal. None of it was unusual. Seeking Arrangement had millions of users. College students represented a significant portion of them. The site itself marketed to that demographic, advertising the possibility of having tuition paid, student loans reduced, a lifestyle upgraded. Among the men Mackenzie exchanged messages with was a man named Ayoola Ajayi, and now we have to run his 2 tracks, because Ajayi had a surface and an underneath that were even further apart than Mackenzie's. The surface of Ayoola Ajayi looked respectable. He was 31 years old in 2019. He had been born in Nigeria. He had come to the United States and settled in Utah. He had served in the Army National Guard. He had studied information technology. He worked in the tech sector. He owned a home in the Rose Park neighborhood of Salt Lake City, a working-class area on the western side of the city, where small bungalows and modest ranch-style houses sat on narrow lots. He drove a white Chevy truck. He kept the lawn mowed. He was quiet. The neighbors knew him as the man who kept to himself. If you had looked Ajayi up on LinkedIn, you would have found a professional profile, IT credentials, military service, a homeowner, a taxpayer, a man who appeared to be building a life in the way that society rewards, stable employment, property, a record of service to his country. He was the kind of person you would not look twice at in a grocery store, the kind of person you would not feel uneasy sitting next to on a bus. Now the other track. In 2018, Ajayi met a woman through a dating app. They arranged to meet. During their encounter, he pinned her down. He bit her. He left bruising across her body and bite marks on her skin. The woman reported the assault. She went to the police. She showed them the marks. The case was documented. Ajayi was known to law enforcement as a man who had used physical force against a woman he had met through the internet. He was not charged with a felony. The case moved through the system the way these cases often move through the system, which is to say slowly, incompletely, and without the kind of resolution that removes a dangerous person from circulation. Ajayi went back to his life. He went back to the dating apps. He went back to Seeking Arrangement. He continued messaging women. He continued arranging meetings. He was still active on these platforms when he began exchanging messages with Mackenzie Lueck. And then there was the room. In April of 2019, 2 months before Mackenzie Lueck would climb into his truck, Ajayi contacted a contractor. He wanted work done on his house. Specifically, he wanted a room built beneath his front porch, a hidden room. He wanted it soundproofed. He wanted hooks installed on the walls. He wanted entry controlled by a fingerprint scanner. He described the project in matter-of-fact terms, as though he were asking for a deck extension or a bathroom remodel. Think about that timeline, April 2019. The room is commissioned, soundproofed, hooks on the walls, a fingerprint scanner so that only he could access it. 2 months later, a woman he had been communicating with on Seeking Arrangement would be dead, her body burned in his backyard. The contractor later told investigators about the project. He described Ajayi as calm, businesslike, not agitated, not secretive in his demeanor, despite the extraordinary nature of the request. He wanted what he wanted, and he described it clearly. A hidden, soundproofed room with hooks and a fingerprint lock, accessible only to him. Beneath the surface of his house, invisible from the street, invisible from the neighbors, invisible from anyone who did not know it was there. Whether Mackenzie Lueck was always the intended victim is something no one outside of Ajayi's mind can answer with certainty. But the room was not built on impulse. It was planned. It was designed. It was an infrastructure project for violence, and it was underway months before the night at Hatch Park. Now the two tracks begin to converge. On June 16th, 2019, Mackenzie Lueck was in El Segundo, California. She was there for the funeral of her grandmother. Her grandmother had died, and Mackenzie had flown home to be with her family, to sit through the service, to grieve, to do what families do in those hours of collective sorrow. She stood beside her parents. She said goodbye to a woman who had been part of her life since birth. The details of the funeral are private. They belong to the Lueck family, but the fact of it matters. The emotional weight of it matters. Because of what came next. After the funeral, Mackenzie booked a return flight to Salt Lake City. She did not stay an extra day. She did not spend the night with her parents. She flew back that evening, departing from Los Angeles International Airport at approximately 9 p.m. Pacific time on a Delta flight that would connect through Dallas/Fort Worth. Her flight from Dallas landed in Salt Lake City just before 2 a.m. Mountain Time on June 17. During the flight, or possibly during the layover in Dallas, Mackenzie was texting. She was in communication with Ayoola Ajayi. They were arranging to meet that night, not the next day, not later in the week. That night, when she landed, she would take a Lyft directly from the airport to a meeting point, and he would be there waiting. At 1 a.m., while still in transit, Mackenzie sent a text to her parents. It said she had arrived safely. This was a lie, or more precisely, it was premature. She had not yet landed. The message was sent to reassure them, to prevent them from staying up worrying, to close the loop so that they could go to sleep believing their daughter was home safe. It was a small, ordinary kindness, the kind of text millions of children send to millions of parents every single night. I'm home. I'm safe. Don't worry. Go to sleep. Greg and Ayoola Lueck read the message. They went to bed. They would not hear from their daughter again. Mackenzie's Delta flight touched down at Salt Lake City International Airport at approximately 1:35 a.m. on June 17. She collected her bag. She walked through the terminal. She opened the Lyft app and ordered a ride. She entered the destination as Hatch Park in North Salt Lake. Not her apartment, not a friend's house, not a restaurant or a bar, a park. At 2 in the morning, the Lyft driver who picked her up later, a young woman, polite, quiet, not visibly intoxicated, not distressed. She sat in the back. She looked at her phone. The drive from the airport to Hatch Park takes approximately 15 minutes, depending on traffic, and at that hour there was no traffic. The streets of Salt Lake City at 2 a.m. are wide and empty. The mountains sit as dark silhouettes against the sky. The city sleeps. The Lyft moved north, past the oil refineries at the edge of the city, past the modest neighborhoods of North Salt Lake, into the quiet residential area surrounding the park. They arrived at approximately 2:55 a.m. A car was already in the parking lot. The Lyft driver saw it. Mackenzie saw it. She got out. She walked toward it. The driver noted that she appeared to recognize the vehicle. She did not ask him to wait. She did not appear nervous or reluctant. She walked with the casual certainty of someone meeting a person they expected to meet. She got into the passenger side of the waiting car. The Lyft driver pulled out of the parking lot. He drove to his next fare. He did not think about the drop-off again until police came to speak with him days later. Mackenzie's phone sent its last signal at 2:59 a.m. She had texted Ajayi to confirm she was there. He had responded. And then the phone went dark. Cell tower records showed no further pings, no outgoing calls, no data usage, no GPS signal. The phone either lost power, was powered off, or was destroyed. Given what investigators would later learn, the most likely explanation is that Ajayi took the phone from her and either turned it off or removed the battery and SIM card almost immediately after she entered his vehicle. At that moment, at 2:59 a.m. on June 17, 2019, Mackenzie Lueck ceased to exist in any traceable digital form. A 23-year-old woman in 2019, a woman who had been texting and posting and communicating through her phone constantly, who had ordered a Lyft and sent a message to her parents and exchanged texts with Ajayi all within the previous few hours, simply vanished from the electronic world in a single instant. No more texts, no more posts, no more signals. The car she climbed into was a white Matison truck. It belonged to Ayoola Ajayi, and he drove it from the parking lot of Hatch Park to his house on 547 North 1000 West in the Rose Park neighborhood of Salt Lake City. The drive takes about 12 minutes. What happened inside that house is known in broad terms from forensic evidence, from the physical condition of Mackenzie's remains when they were eventually recovered, and from the statements Ajayi eventually made to investigators. The specific sequence, the exact duration, the precise mechanism of death. These details were presented in court, but not all of them were made public in full. What is known is this: Mackenzie Lueck was killed inside that house. Her arms were bound behind her back. She was burned, and she was buried in the backyard. The burning did not happen discreetly. Ajayi built a fire in his backyard. Neighbors noticed it. In the days following June 17, multiple residents on Ajayi Street recalled an unusual bonfire in his yard. This was not a neighborhood where people regularly had bonfires. The lots were small. The houses were close together. A fire in the backyard was noticeable. But what made this fire particularly memorable was the smell. Neighbors described it as horrible, acrid, chemical. One neighbor said it smelled like something burning that should not have been burning. Another described it as a combination of gasoline and something organic, something that produced a thick, greasy smoke that hung in the air and did not dissipate the way wood smoke does. Ajayi had used gasoline as an accelerant. He had burned Mackenzie's body in an open fire in his backyard, in a residential neighborhood, within view and smell of his neighbors' homes. The audacity of it is staggering. The casualness of it is chilling. He did not drive to a remote location. He did not use an industrial furnace. He lit a fire in his yard, poured gasoline on it, and burned a human body while his neighbors slept in their beds a few dozen feet away. After the fire, he buried what remained in a shallow pit in the backyard. He covered it with dirt. He went back inside his house. He went to work the next day. He answered his phone. He checked his email. He existed in the world as though nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the world was beginning to notice that Mackenzie Lueck had disappeared. The first sign came on June 17 itself. Mackenzie did not show up for a commitment. She did not respond to text messages. Friends reached out. No response. They reached out again. Nothing. By June 18, concern was spreading through her social circle. Her sorority sisters were texting each other. Has anyone heard from Mackenzie? When was the last time you talked to her? She was supposed to be back from California. Where is she? Her parents had not heard from her since the text on June 16 saying she had arrived safely. They called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. They called again. Voicemail. They texted. No response. The dread began to build. Not yet panic. Not yet the full, cold terror that comes when a parent knows something is truly wrong, but the precursor. The unease. The feeling that the silence is too long, too complete, too unlike their daughter. On June 20, 3 days after the murder, Greg Lueck filed a missing person report with the Salt Lake City Police Department. Mackenzie had not been seen or heard from since the early morning hours of June 17. Her phone was dead. Her social media was silent. She had not attended classes. She had not returned to her apartment. She had, by every measurable standard, vanished. The police investigation began. Detectives pulled her phone records. They spoke to her friends. They spoke to her sorority sisters. They traced her movements on the night of June 16 and the morning of June 17. The Lyft ride from the airport to Hatch Park was identified quickly. The Lyft driver was interviewed. He described the drop-off. He described the car waiting in the lot. He described Mackenzie walking toward it with no hesitation. The phone records told a story of their own. The texts with Ajayi, the arrangement to meet, the final message at 2:58 a.m., the phone going dark at 2:59. Ajayi's name appeared in the investigation almost immediately. He was the last known person Mackenzie had communicated with before her disappearance. He was the person she had gone to meet. Detectives went to speak with him. And here is where Ajayi's second track becomes extraordinary in its brazenness. He cooperated, or rather, he performed cooperation. He sat down with detectives. He answered their questions. He was polite. He was calm. He was helpful. He confirmed that he had been in contact with Mackenzie. He confirmed that they had arranged to meet. He said she had texted him, and he had gone to Hatch Park to pick her up. Then he told them what happened next. According to Ajayi, he and Mackenzie had met at the park. They had talked briefly, and then she had left. She had gotten out of his car and gotten into another car, a car driven by someone else, someone she apparently knew. He said he did not know who this other person was. He said he had not seen Mackenzie since. He said he had tried to text her after she left, but received no response. He offered a possible explanation for why she might have stopped communicating with him. He told the detectives that once he had sent Mackenzie his photos, she had stopped responding, and he speculated that maybe she did not want to date someone of his race. He framed himself as the rejected party, the man who had tried and been turned away. He presented himself as a minor character in his own crime, a man who had shown up for a date only to be passed over for someone else. He offered his phone, he offered his records. He said, in effect, "Look through everything. I have nothing to hide." And the entire time he was sitting in that police station, performing helpfulness and injured dignity, the burned remains of Mackenzie Lueck were buried in a shallow pit in his backyard, less than 6 miles from where he sat. The performance was calculated. Every element of it was designed to deflect. The cooperation signaled innocence. The willingness to hand over records suggested transparency. The racial rejection narrative served a specific purpose. It gave the detectives a plausible, sympathetic reason why communication had ended. He was not just denying involvement. He was constructing an alternative story, one in which he was the victim of prejudice, rather than the perpetrator of murder. The detectives were not fooled, but they did not yet have the evidence to arrest him. They noted inconsistencies. They noted the timeline. They noted that Ajayi was the last known contact, and that no evidence of any other car or any other person at Hatch Park existed, apart from his claim. But noting inconsistencies is not the same as proving murder, and at that point, Mackenzie's body had not been found. She was still classified as a missing person. There was no confirmed crime scene. There was no forensic evidence linking Ajayi to harm. While the investigation continued behind the scenes, the public search for Mackenzie Lueck was gaining momentum. Missing person flyers went up across Salt Lake City. Her photo was everywhere. The blonde hair, the wide smile, the sorority photo. Local media ran the story. Then national media picked it up. A young, attractive college student vanishes after a late-night Lyft ride. The story had every element that draws cameras and headlines. Her sorority sisters organized search parties. They walked through parks. They knocked on doors. They printed flyers and handed them out at intersections. There were candlelight vigils. There were social media campaigns. The hashtag Find Mackenzie Lueck trended. Tips poured into the police department. People reported seeing her at gas stations, at bus stops, in cars on the freeway. None of the sightings were confirmed. None of them were her. Her parents flew to Salt Lake City. Greg Lueck stood in front of cameras and pleaded for information. His composure was remarkable. He spoke clearly. He asked for anyone who knew anything to come forward. He thanked the police. He thanked the community. He held himself together with the kind of rigid, deliberate control that comes from understanding that breaking down in public will not bring his daughter home. And through all of this, through the flyers and the vigils and the search parties, and the media coverage, and the parents' anguish, Ayoola Ajayi was going to work. He was answering his phone. He was living in his house. The house with the backyard where the fire had been. The backyard where the soil had been recently disturbed. The house that still, if you stood close enough, carried the faint chemical residue of what he had done. The investigation tightened around him methodically. Detectives obtained warrants for his phone records, his internet activity, his financial transactions. They began to map his movements on the night of June 16 and 17. Cell tower data placed his phone at Hatch Park at the time of the Lyft drop-off. It placed his phone back at his home address shortly after. The timing was consistent with picking someone up at the park and driving them to his house. They pulled his browsing history. They examined his seeking arrangement profile. They found the message exchanges with Mackenzie dating back months. The conversations were not casual or ambiguous. They showed an ongoing arrangement, a connection that had been established, maintained, and escalated over time. The meeting at Hatch Park was not their first contact. It was the culmination of a relationship that had been building through the platform. They spoke to his neighbors. The bonfire was mentioned. The smell was described. The timing was noted. One neighbor placed the fire on June 17 or June 18, immediately after Mackenzie's disappearance. They spoke to the contractor who had been hired to build the room beneath the porch, the soundproofing, the hooks, the fingerprint scanner. 2 months before the murder, the contractor described the project. He described Ajayi's demeanor: calm, specific, a man who knew exactly what he wanted built and was willing to pay for it. They identified the prior assault victim, the woman from 2018 who had met Ajayi through a dating app, the woman he had pinned down and bitten, the documented injuries, the bite marks. The police report that had been filed and that had not resulted in consequences severe enough to remove him from the apps from the platforms, from the dating ecosystem where he continued to find victims. And then they found the evidence that broke the case open. On June 26, 9 days after the murder, investigators obtained a search warrant for Ajayi's property. They arrived at 547 North 1000 West with forensic teams, cadaver dogs, and excavation equipment. The cadaver dogs hit on the backyard immediately, the area near the fire pit, the disturbed soil. But when they dug, they found something they did not expect. They found evidence of a burial, charred material, burned remnants, gasoline residue, but the bulk of the remains were not there. The pit had been disturbed recently. The soil had been dug up and then partially filled back in. Something had been removed. This was the second burial. At some point between the murder on June 17 and the search on June 26, Ajayi had returned to his backyard, dug up Mackenzie's remains, and moved them. He had put them in his vehicle and driven approximately 85 miles north to Logan Canyon, a rugged forested area in northern Utah. He had reburied them in a more remote location, hoping that if the police searched his property, they would not find the body. The reburial was an act of extraordinary cold calculation. It meant that Ajayi had not panicked after the murder. He had not fallen apart. He had not confessed to a friend or fled the state. He had gone about his daily life while simultaneously monitoring the investigation. And when he sensed that the police were closing in, when the interviews became more pointed and the questions became more specific, he had gone back to his yard in the middle of the night, unearthed the remains of the woman he had killed, loaded them into his truck, and driven an hour and a half north on Interstate 15 to bury them again in a place he thought no one would look. Think about that drive, 85 miles, an hour and a half of highway driving, with the remains of Mackenzie Lueck in the back of his truck, past the suburbs of Salt Lake City, past Ogden, past Brigham City, into the canyon, the mountains rising on either side, the road narrowing, the forest closing in. He pulled over. He dug. He buried her again. He drove home. He went to bed. The forensic evidence recovered from the backyard, even without the full remains, was damning. Charred bone fragments were found in the fire pit area. DNA analysis confirmed they belonged to Mackenzie Lueck. Her personal belongings, partially burned, were recovered from the property. The soil showed accelerant residue consistent with gasoline. On June 28, 2019, 11 days after the murder, Ayoola Ajayi was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, aggravated kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and desecration of a human body. He was taken into custody at his home. He did not resist. He was photographed in the back of a police car, his expression blank, his eyes forward. The arrest did not end the search for Mackenzie. Her remains had been moved, and the police needed to find them. Ajayi did not immediately reveal where he had taken her. Investigators worked with cell tower data, GPS records from Ajayi's phone and vehicle, and witness accounts to trace his movements in the days between the murder and the arrest. The data pointed north. It pointed to Logan Canyon. On June 28, the same day as the arrest, search teams were deployed to Logan Canyon. It is a vast, heavily wooded area. The canyon stretches for miles. The terrain is steep and uneven. Finding a burial site without precise coordinates is extraordinarily difficult, but the cell tower data narrowed the search area, and cadaver dogs were brought in. They found her. Mackenzie Lueck's remains were recovered from a shallow grave in Logan Canyon. She had been wrapped in material and buried in a depression in the earth. When the forensic team carefully excavated the site, they found that her arms were still bound behind her back. The binding had survived the fire and the 2 burials. She had been restrained before she was killed, and the restraints had never been removed. That detail, the arms bound behind the back, tells a story that no amount of Ajayi's performance of innocence could obscure. This was not an accident. This was not a confrontation that escalated. This was not a moment of rage that a man deeply regretted. Mackenzie Lueck was bound. She was restrained. She could not move her arms. She could not fight back. She could not escape. Whatever happened to her in that house on North 1000 West, it happened to a woman who had been physically prevented from defending herself. The binding, combined with the soundproofed room, combined with the hooks on the walls, combined with the premeditated meeting at 3 a.m., combined with the disabled security cameras, tell a single, unified story. Ajayi did not lose control. He established it. He built the infrastructure for what he intended to do. He lured a woman to a location where she would not be seen. He took her to a place where she would not be heard. He bound her so that she could not resist, and then he killed her. Ajayi's home security system is a detail that deserves its own space in this story. He had cameras. He had a monitoring system. Most homeowners who install security cameras do so for protection, to record what happens around their property, so that they have a record in case of a break-in or an incident. Ajayi had such a system, and on the night of June 16 and the early morning of June 17, 2019, he turned it off. He did not forget. He did not experience a technical malfunction. He manually disabled his own security cameras before he left his house to drive to Hatch Park. He did this because he knew what he was going to do when he returned. He knew he was going to bring a woman into his house, and he knew what was going to happen to her, and he knew that he could not allow any of it to be recorded. The disabled cameras are premeditation in its purest form. They are not evidence of a man acting in the heat of the moment. They are evidence of a man who thought ahead, who anticipated consequences, who understood that what he was about to do was a crime that would be investigated, and who took specific, deliberate steps to ensure that the investigation would not find visual evidence inside his home. When the arrest was announced, the community of Salt Lake City reacted with a mixture of grief and horror. The vigils that had been held in hope were now held in mourning. The sorority sisters who had put up flyers and organized searches now stood together in silence, processing the reality that their friend was not coming home. The search was over. The worst-case scenario, the one everyone had been refusing to articulate, was confirmed. Mackenzie's parents released a statement. They thanked the police. They thanked the community. They asked for privacy. That request for privacy was made quietly and with dignity, and it said more about the Lueck family's character than any prepared remarks could have. The media coverage intensified after the arrest, and with it came a scrutiny that Mackenzie's family had dreaded. Her seeking arrangement profile became public. The sugar daddy angle became the headline. Cable news hosts discussed it. Online commentators weighed in. Some of them did what a certain kind of commentator always does in cases like this. They speculated about her choices. They used words like risky, like dangerous lifestyle, like she put herself in that situation, as though meeting someone from a dating app was an act of self-destruction rather than a commonplace feature of modern dating, as though the existence of her profile on Seeking Arrangement was a contributing factor to her death rather than a coincidental detail of the medium through which she encountered her killer. This framing is not just wrong, it is dangerous. Mackenzie Lueck's profile on Seeking Arrangement did not kill her. Ayoola Ajayi killed her. He would have been dangerous on Tinder. He would have been dangerous on Bumble. He would have been dangerous on any platform, in any bar, at any social gathering where he had the opportunity to isolate a woman and enact a violence he had been planning. The platform was the delivery mechanism. The danger was the man. Confusing the two allows the man to hide behind the moral discomfort people feel about sugar dating, as though Mackenzie's willingness to use a controversial app somehow diminishes the horror of what was done to her, or somehow excuses the failure of the system to stop a man who had already assaulted one woman from accessing another. The 2018 assault is a thread that runs through this entire story and demands examination. A woman met Ajayi through a dating app. He pinned her down. He bit her hard enough to leave marks. She reported it. Police were notified. The incident was documented, and then nothing happened. Nothing happened with sufficient speed or severity to remove Ajayi from the pool of men who could, with a few swipes and a few messages, arrange to meet a woman alone, at night, in an isolated location. This is a systemic failure. It is not unique to this case. It is a pattern repeated across jurisdictions, across decades, across thousands of cases in which a man commits an act of violence against a woman. The act is reported, and the response is insufficient to prevent the next act. The woman who was bitten and bruised by Ajayi in 2018 did what she was supposed to do. She reported, she showed her injuries, she cooperated with law enforcement, and the system responded with something less than what was required to stop him. By the time Mackenzie Lueck sat down in Ajayi's truck at 3 a.m., the system had already had one chance to intervene. It had failed. The legal proceedings that followed the arrest were protracted. Ajayi was held without bail. He was represented by defense attorneys who did what defense attorneys are ethically obligated to do, which is to ensure that the state meets its burden of proof at every stage and that the defendant's rights are not violated. This is not a criticism of the defense. It is a description of how the system works. Even in a case where the evidence is overwhelming, the process must be followed. In the months after the arrest, additional forensic evidence was processed. The fire pit in Ajayi's backyard yielded DNA evidence. The charred fragments were confirmed as human bone. The DNA matched Mackenzie Lueck. Her personal items, partially destroyed by fire, were identified. The The gasoline residue was analyzed, the soil patterns were documented, the binding materials were examined. Every piece of physical evidence pointed to a single conclusion. Mackenzie had been killed in or near that house, burned in that yard, and buried in that ground before being moved to Logan Canyon. Ajayi's digital footprint was equally damning. His phone records showed the communication with Mackenzie. His cell tower pings placed him at Hatch Park at the time of the pickup, and at his home immediately after. His internet search history, which investigators obtained through warrants, revealed searches related to the disposal of bodies, though the specific search terms were not all made public. His financial records showed purchases consistent with the materials found at the fire site. The surveillance footage from the area around his house, while his own cameras were disabled, captured some of his movements. A neighbor's security camera showed his truck arriving home in the early morning hours of June 17. The timing was consistent with the Lyft drop-off at Hatch Park and a direct drive to Rose Park. Through all of this, the question that hung over the case was not whether Ajayi had killed Mackenzie Lueck. The evidence answered that question conclusively. The question was whether there had been other victims. The soundproofed room, the hooks on the walls, the fingerprint scanner, the prior assault, the calculated, methodical nature of the killing and disposal, the cold comfort with which he drove 85 miles with a body in his truck. None of this pointed to a first-time offender. None of this suggested a man who had snapped once and would never snap again. Everything about the infrastructure, the planning, the execution, and the cover-up suggested experience, suggested familiarity with the logistics of violence. Investigators looked into whether Ajayi could be connected to other missing person cases or unsolved crimes. As of the conclusion of the legal proceedings, no additional victims were publicly identified. But the soundproofed room remains a detail that resists easy explanation as a one-time project. Rooms like that are not built for a single use. They are built because the person building them intends to use them repeatedly. They are investments in future violence. As the case moved toward trial, the prosecution assembled its evidence into a narrative that left no room for reasonable doubt. The prior relationship through seeking arrangement, the arranged meeting, the Lyft drop-off, the cell tower data, the disabled security cameras, the bonfire, the smell, the charred remains, the DNA, the binding, the reburial, the lies to police. Each piece was a link in a chain that stretched from the first message on seeking arrangement to the recovery of Mackenzie's body in Logan Canyon. Ajayi's defense team faced a wall of evidence with few openings. There was no alibi. There was no alternative suspect supported by evidence. There was no plausible innocent explanation for the DNA, the fire, the gasoline, the burial, the reburial, or the disabled cameras. The strategy, to the extent that one was publicly articulated, focused on the details of the charges rather than the fundamental question of guilt. Then, in October 2020, Ayoola Ajayi entered a guilty plea. He pleaded guilty to aggravated murder, aggravated kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and desecration of a human body. The plea came after more than a year of legal proceedings, during which time he had been held in Salt Lake County Jail. The guilty plea meant there would be no trial, no jury selection, no opening statements, no cross-examination of witnesses, no forensic experts on the stand walking through DNA analysis and fire debris patterns and cell tower triangulation. All of that work, all of that preparation, all of those months of evidence assembly were rendered procedurally unnecessary by two words: guilty, Your Honor. For Mackenzie's family, the plea was a fractured mercy. It spared them from sitting through a trial, from hearing in graphic detail what had been done to their daughter, from seeing crime scene photographs projected on a courtroom screen, from watching the man who killed her sit at the defense table day after day as witnesses recounted her final hours. It spared them from the uncertainty of a jury deliberation, the agony of waiting for 12 strangers to decide whether the evidence was sufficient. The plea eliminated those horrors, but it also eliminated the opportunity for a public reckoning. A trial would have placed every detail into the record. It would have forced Ajayi to sit and listen as the full scope of his premeditation, his violence, and his deception was laid out in open court. It would have given the prosecution the chance to present its case in full, to ensure that every fact was spoken aloud and documented and entered into the public record for anyone to read. The plea collapsed all of that into a single hearing. The facts were summarized rather than presented. The evidence was referenced rather than displayed. The sentencing hearing took place on the same day as the plea. Under the terms of the agreement, Ajayi was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison. He would never be released. He would never again walk on a street or drive a car or open a dating app or sit across from a woman he had lured to a meeting under false pretenses. In the courtroom, Ajayi stood with his head down. He did not speak at length. He did not offer an explanation. He did not apologize. The judge addressed him and imposed the sentence: life without parole, no chance of release, no review date, no possibility of ever standing in that parking lot at Hatch Park again, waiting for another car to arrive. Mackenzie's family was present. They had chosen not to read a victim impact statement aloud. This was a deliberate decision. In many murder cases, the victim's family uses the sentencing hearing as an opportunity to speak directly to the defendant, to describe the devastation he caused, to put into words the depth of their loss and their anger and their grief. The Lueck family chose silence. They chose to keep their pain private. They asked for quiet. That choice deserves respect. It is tempting, for those of us who consume true crime narratives, to want the emotional climax, the tearful statement, the parents looking at the killer and telling him what he took from them. The room in tears, the catharsis. But the Lueck family did not owe anyone that moment. Their grief was not a performance. Their loss was not content. They buried their daughter. They buried her twice, in a sense, once when her remains were recovered and formally laid to rest, and once in the courtroom when the case was closed. They did both with as much privacy as the circumstances allowed. And they asked the rest of us to step back. But before we honor that request and step back, there are things that need to be said about how Mackenzie Lueck is remembered, and how she should be remembered. She was not a cautionary tale. Her story is not a warning about the dangers of sugar dating. It is not an after-school special about meeting strangers from the internet. It is not evidence that young women who use dating apps are reckless or naive or inviting harm. Mackenzie Lueck was an adult. She was capable of making her own decisions about her dating life, her financial arrangements, her sexuality, and how she spent her time. Every adult has that right. Every adult exercises that right, usually without being murdered for it. The fact that she met her killer through seeking arrangement is a detail of the case. It is the mechanism through which a predator accessed a victim. It is not the cause of her death. The cause of her death was Ayoola Ajayi. He was the active agent. He was the person who disabled his cameras. He was the person who drove to a park at 3 a.m. He was the person who brought her to his house. He was the person who bound her arms. He was the person who killed her. He was the person who burned her. He was the person who buried her. He was the person who dug her up and buried her again. He did all of these things. She did none of them. Any narrative that shifts the focus from his actions to her choices is a narrative that serves his interests, not hers. It allows the conversation to become about risk management, about what women should and should not do, about the dangers of certain apps or certain behaviors, rather than about the man who committed the murder and the systems that failed to stop him. It is easier to talk about what Mackenzie should have done differently than to talk about why a man who had already assaulted a woman was free to access dating platforms and meet new victims. It is more comfortable to discuss personal responsibility than systemic failure. But comfort is not the point. Truth is the point. And the truth is that Mackenzie Lueck did not die because of her choices. She died because of his. The same scrutiny should apply to the infrastructure of violence that Ajayi had built. The soundproofed room was under construction 2 months before the murder. 2 months. That is not impulse. That is not a bad night that spiraled out of control. That is planning. That is preparation. That is a man investing time and money into the construction of a space designed to contain and conceal violence. The hooks on the walls were not decorative. The fingerprint scanner was not a novelty gadget. These were functional components of a space designed to hold a person against their will. The question of whether that room was ever used for its intended purpose before the night of June 17 is one that investigators explored, but that was never publicly answered in definitive terms. What is known is that the room was commissioned and partially constructed. What is known is that its specifications were consistent with the restraint and silencing of a human being. What is known is that the man who commissioned it went on to bind, kill, and burn a woman in the same house where the room was being built. The connections to broader patterns of violence are unavoidable. Ajayi was not an anomaly. He was a type, a man who presented well on the surface, who had credentials and employment and military service, who was polite in interviews and cooperative with authorities, who understood how to manage his public presentation while conducting his private violence. The gap between his two tracks, between the IT professional and the man with the soundproofed room, was not a contradiction. It was a strategy. The surface was the cover. The underneath was the reality. This duality is what makes cases like this so difficult to prevent. If violent men looked like violent men, the problem would be simpler. If they walked around with visible markers of danger, the world would be safer. But they do not. They look like Ajayi looked. They look like the quiet neighbor, the reliable employee, the man who served his country, the man who mowed his lawn and drove his truck, and went to work and came home and built a hidden room beneath his porch. They are invisible until they are not. And by the time they become visible, it is too late. Mackenzie Lueck saw track A of Ajayi's life. She saw the man on seeking arrangement, the profile, the photos, the messages. She communicated with him for months. She agreed to meet him. She felt comfortable enough to take a Lyft to a park at 3 a.m. and climb into his car. She did not feel danger. She did not hesitate. She walked toward his car with confidence. This is not an indictment of her judgment. This is an indictment of his deception. He was good at what he did. He was practiced. He knew how to present himself. He knew how to earn trust. He knew how to make a woman feel safe enough to get into his car in the middle of the night. That skill, the ability to project safety while harboring violence, is the most dangerous tool a predator possesses. It is more dangerous than the soundproofed room, more dangerous than the gasoline, more dangerous than the binding, because it is the tool that gets a woman into the car. Everything else follows from that. There is one more parallel track to consider, and it is the most painful one. On June 16, 2019, Mackenzie Lueck stood at her grandmother's funeral. She mourned a death. She said goodbye to someone she loved. She was surrounded by family. She held her parents. She did what humans do in the face of death. She bore witness to it. She felt its weight. She let it press against her chest and her throat and her eyes. And then she flew to Salt Lake City. She took a connecting flight through Dallas. She landed at 2 a.m. She texted her parents that she was safe. She took a Lyft to a park. She got into a truck, and she was murdered. From one death to another. From her grandmother's funeral to her own. Less than 24 hours. That transit, that impossible compression of grief and violence, is the structural heartbreak of this story. Mackenzie went from burying someone she loved to being buried by someone she barely knew. She went from a ceremony of farewell, conducted with flowers and prayers, and family gathered around a casket, to a backyard bonfire that smelled of gasoline. She went from her parents' embrace to a stranger's binding. The proximity of those two events is not a coincidence that the narrative imposes for dramatic effect. It is simply what happened. It is the sequence of events as they occurred, and it is almost unbearable to hold both of them in your mind at the same time. The funeral and the murder. The grandmother's death, which was mourned and honored and processed through the rituals that humans have developed over millennia to cope with loss, and Mackenzie's death, which was hidden and burned and buried and denied for 12 days, while her parents put up flyers and pleaded on television and lived in the suspended agony of not knowing. The grandmother had a funeral. Mackenzie's family had 12 days of silence, followed by the worst news a parent can receive. The investigation that followed the arrest produced one additional detail that merits attention. When investigators examined the security camera footage from the area around Ajayi's home, they found that his cameras were not the only ones in the neighborhood. Other homes had cameras. Businesses on nearby streets had cameras. The patchwork of private surveillance that exists in most American neighborhoods captured fragments of Ajayi's movements on the nights in question. This footage, combined with the cell tower data and the GPS information from Ajayi's devices, allowed investigators to reconstruct his movements with considerable precision. They could track his drive to Hatch Park. They could track his return to Rose Park. They could estimate the timing of the fire based on when neighbors reported the smell and when activity was detected on the cameras. They could track his drive to Logan Canyon for the reburial. The picture that emerged was one of meticulous, unhurried execution. Ajayi did not rush. He did not make panic decisions. He moved through the aftermath of the murder with the deliberate pace of a man executing a plan he had thought through in advance. He burned the body not in a frantic attempt to destroy evidence, but as a preconsidered method of disposal. He buried the remains not in a hasty scramble, but in a location he had apparently selected. He reburied them not in a blind panic, but after calculating that the original burial site was at risk of discovery. Each step was taken with awareness. Each step was taken with intent. Each step was taken by a man who understood what he had done, understood the consequences if he were caught, and understood what steps were necessary to avoid those consequences. The fact that he was caught anyway, the fact that the evidence trail he left was sufficient to identify him, arrest him, and secure a conviction, does not diminish the planning that went into the cover-up. It simply means that his planning was not as good as he believed it to be. The community of Salt Lake City was left to process what had happened in their midst. A woman had been murdered and burned in a residential neighborhood, and no one had intervened. Neighbors had smelled the fire and found it strange, but had not investigated. The house at 547 North 1000 West had contained a crime scene for nearly 2 weeks, while the rest of the neighborhood went about its business. This is not a criticism of the neighbors. It is a description of how violence hides in plain sight. People do not expect their neighbor to be burning a body. They smell something unpleasant and close their windows. They see smoke and assume yard waste. They hear a sound and tell themselves it was nothing. This is normal. This is how all of us respond to the unexpected. We default to the mundane explanation because the alternative is unthinkable. But the alternative was real, and it had happened feet from their bedroom windows. Rose Park neighborhood itself became a minor character in the media coverage. Journalists described its modest homes, its working-class demographics, its distance from the University of Utah campus, where Mackenzie had been a student. The implicit framing was one of surprise. How could this happen here? How could a murder be committed and concealed in such a quiet residential area? The answer, of course, is that murder is committed and concealed in quiet residential areas all the time. Violence does not announce itself by choosing dramatic locations. It happens in ordinary houses, on ordinary streets. And the ordinariness is part of what conceals it. In the aftermath of the case, attention turned briefly to the platforms that had facilitated the connection between Mackenzie and Ajayi. Seeking arrangement faced scrutiny. Questions were asked about its vetting processes, about whether it screened users for criminal history, about what safeguards it employed to protect the women who used it. The platform's spokesperson offered condolences and noted that the site encouraged users to take safety precautions. These were not dishonest answers, but they were insufficient ones. A platform that profits from connecting young women with older men has a responsibility that extends beyond a safety tips page. The specifics of what, if any, changes were implemented are not a matter of public record at the detail level required for accurate reporting, but the broader conversation that the case prompted about the safety of dating apps in general, and sugar dating apps in particular, missed the central point. The danger was not the app. The danger was the man on the app. The conversation about platform safety is worth having, but not at the expense of the more fundamental conversation about why a man who had already assaulted a woman was free to use these platforms to access another one. The criminal justice system's handling of the 2018 assault is the true systemic failure in this story. Not the platform, not the technology, not the practice of sugar dating. The system. A woman was assaulted, she reported it. The man who assaulted her was not removed from the population of potential predators with sufficient speed or severity, and 15 months later, he killed someone. Whether faster or more aggressive prosecution of the 2018 case would have prevented Mackenzie Lueck's murder is unknowable. The counterfactual is impossible to resolve, but the pattern is familiar. A first offense is minimized. A violent act against a woman is treated as a lesser matter. A man is allowed to continue operating in the spaces where he found his first victim because the system did not treat that first victim's experience with sufficient gravity. And then there is a second victim, and this time she does not survive. Mackenzie Lueck was 23 years old. She was studying kinesiology. She wanted to be a nurse. She was in a sorority. She had just been to her grandmother's funeral. She liked to swim. She took selfies. She used dating apps. She had a sugar daddy arrangement. She was figuring out her life in the way that 23-year-olds figure out their lives, which is to say imperfectly, experimentally, with a mixture of ambition and uncertainty, and a belief that the future was long enough to accommodate course corrections. She did not get that future. It was taken from her by a man who had been preparing to take it for months. A man who had built a room for the purpose, who had disabled his cameras for the purpose, who had driven to a park at 3 a.m. for the purpose, who had lured her into his vehicle for the purpose, whose every action on the night of June 16 and the morning of June 17 was oriented toward a single premeditated outcome. Ajayi sits in a Utah state prison. He will sit there until he dies. His cell is not soundproofed. There are no hooks on the walls. There is no fingerprint scanner. The room he built for himself, the room beneath the porch of his house in Rose Park, was never completed. The contractor never finished the project. The room exists in partial form, a half-built monument to violence that was planned but not fully realized, and a reminder that whatever Ajayi intended it for, his plans extended beyond a single night and a single victim. The house on 547 North 1000 West was seized by authorities. Its disposition, whether it was sold, demolished or left to stand, became a matter for the courts and the city. For the neighbors who lived around it, the house was no longer just a house. It was the place where a young woman was killed and burned. It was the source of the smoke and the smell that they had tried to explain away. It was the place that proved that the unthinkable can happen next door. The Lyft driver who dropped Mackenzie off at Hatch Park has never been publicly identified by name. He cooperated fully with the investigation. He provided his account of the drop-off, the waiting car, and Mackenzie's confident walk toward it. He described what he saw, and what he saw was nothing alarming. A passenger getting out of his car and getting into another car. A routine fare ending in a routine manner. He could not have known. He could not have intervened. The events that followed the drop-off were beyond his knowledge and beyond his control. But his testimony matters because it establishes something important about Mackenzie's state of mind in her final minutes. She was not afraid. She was not uncertain. She walked toward Ajayi's truck with the casual familiarity of someone meeting a person she knew and expected to see. She did not look back. She did not hesitate. She trusted the arrangement. She trusted the man she was meeting. That trust was earned through months of communication, through text messages and exchanges on seeking arrangement, and whatever other channels they used. Ajayi had invested time in building that trust. He had presented himself as a certain kind of person. He had maintained the fiction through dozens or perhaps hundreds of messages. He had been, in his communications with Mackenzie, the man he wanted her to believe he was. And she believed him because she had no reason not to. Because nothing in his messages, nothing in his online presence, nothing in their prior interactions gave her cause to fear him. This is what predators do. They do not announce themselves. They build trust. They invest in the relationship. They present a version of themselves that is designed to disarm. And when the trust is established, when the victim feels safe, when the victim walks toward the car without hesitation, they act. Mackenzie Lueck walked toward the car. She opened the door. She climbed in. She sent her last text. And her phone went dark. In the courtroom, on the day of sentencing, Ayoola Ajayi stood with his head down. The judge spoke. The sentence was read, life without parole. The gavel fell. Ajayi was led away. Mackenzie's parents sat in the courtroom. They had been asked by the media if they would read a victim impact statement. They had declined. They asked for privacy. They asked for quiet. The courtroom emptied. The reporters filed their stories. The cameras were turned off. The case, State of Utah v. Ayoola Ajayi, was closed. Mackenzie Lueck is buried in California, near her grandmother, near the place where she grew up, near the ocean she knew as a child. She rests in the state she left on the last night of her life, the state she flew away from to meet a man who was waiting for her in a parking lot in the dark. She was 23 years old. She had 2 tracks to her life, one public, one private. Both belonged to her. Both were hers to live. Neither one invited what happened to her. Neither one excused what was done to her. She was a young woman building a life, and a man who had been building something else entirely took that life from her in the early morning hours of a Monday in June. The family asked for quiet, and so we are quiet. The fire in the backyard has gone out. The parking lot at Hatch Park is empty. The phone is still dark. It will always be dark now. And Ayoola Ajayi will die in a cell, knowing that the room he built was never finished, that the plan he made was not as perfect as he believed, and that the woman he killed has a name that will be spoken long after his is forgotten. Mackenzie Lueck, 23 years old. El Segundo, California. Alpha Chi Omega. Kinesiology. Nursing school. Swimmer. Daughter. Gone from one death to another. From her grandmother's funeral to her own. The family asked for quiet. This is the quiet.